Welcome back, everyone, to Homo Complexus with your host, Richard. Today, we're going to look at another fascinating topic. We're going to look at the origins of the flood myth. You might know it as Noah's Ark, if you're a child of the Bible and Christianity like me, but we're going to look at the origin of this story. And as always in history, it's a weird and wonderful thing, the origins of the flood myth. So let's get straight into it. Now, this flood myth is very closely linked to the thing I ended last episode on, which is something called the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is very closely associated normally with the Assyrians. If you can remember from last episode, again, don't have to go watch, it's up to you. The Assyrians, I'll clarify again, are from northern Iraq. Okay, and they live 3,000, 4,000 years ago, long time ago. And this is where this flood myth comes from. It comes from the lands of the Tigris and the Euphrates, Iraq. Once again. I think in the last video, I said, I'm really bad with my east and west, sorry. I said that the headwaters or the sources of both the Tigris and the Euphrates come from Turkey. That is correct. But I said it was the southwest of Turkey, which makes no sense. It's the southeast, sorry. Just thought I'd clarify there. So let's get into the origins of this flood myth. So even though it's closely tied up with this Epic of Gilgamesh thing, which I promise I'll get to, it's a very cool story. It's one of the oldest stories that was written down anyway. There are arguably far older oral stories than the Epic of Gilgamesh. But this flood myth is older than the Epic of Gilgamesh. Okay, we know that. At least in the written sources, we know that there are older archaeological remains of writing of this flood myth than there are of the Epic of Gilgamesh. And the oldest versions of this flood myth come from around about 3,600 years ago. You can just imagine that. Long time ago. Gilgamesh is about 3,300 to about 3,000-ish years old. So when we think the final version was finalized. Before that, there were many different versions and many different disparate stories before one particular scribe, kind of like Homer in Greek. There was a version of Homer in cuneiform writing in Iraq called Sîn-lēqi-unninni. Definitely not pronouncing that right, but this guy is the one who put together the Epic of Gilgamesh, kind of like Homer did with the Iliad and the Odyssey, even though a quirk of history is that Homer was actually not literate. He couldn't write. He was just someone who orally recited these things, whereas Sîn-lēqi-unninni from Iraq was highly literate and wrote things down. Whatever that, we can't really compare. I don't think being literate means someone is more intelligent at all. I just think it's just interesting to, mention that. So, the oldest version of this flood myth that appears in the Bible later is 3,600 years old. And it is from a massive Babylonian epic, remember from last episode, that the Babylonians are another peoples that come from modern Iraq, also southern Iraq. So there's a Babylonian epic called the Atrahasis, and this was written 3,600 years ago. Now, what goes on in there? This was a definitive, standalone flood myth, and it was, written down in one piece of work. People read this. People knew this story. And it explained, why the gods, not God singular like in the Bible, the gods plural, sent the flood. Apparently, this is pretty funny. They sent it because humans were making too much noise and the gods just wanted to sleep. So they silenced them with a big flood. And there is this god called Enki, who warns mankind, and he specifically warns one man, the Noah of this story, called Atrahasis. And he warns him, listen mate, there's a big flood coming. the gods want to, sleep, you guys are keeping them up, and you need to build a big boat or else you are going to die. I didn't look into actually whether all the animals fit on this boat as well, like in the biblical story, but I wouldn't be surprised at all. Someone in the comments can tell me. And another thing that has eerie similarities to the Christian story that I grew up with, with my child Bible and so forth, was that there's this guy, Atrahasis, who builds a boat, gets his family on the boat. Let's just say, for sake of argument, all the animals that he can on the boat. And then once the flood comes and they're surviving and they're floating around, in this story that's 3,600 years old, predates the Bible, predates the Old Testament, they also send out birds to look for land. Isn't that an eerie similarity? This makes me think, this one detail, together with everything else that we know about how interconnected the ancient, Bronze Age world that we keep coming back to, 3,000 to 5,000 years ago in the Eastern Mediterranean, of which, this Mesopotamian area, this Iraqi area was a big part. This was a very interconnected world. So stories for sure were traveling between people here. And I reckon the authors of the Old Testament picked up this one and just changed the name to Noah and added it into a different theology, which is kind of cool. So there's this god Enki, and he warns Atrahasis, tells him to build a boat. Now, how do we still know about this story? Essentially, the only reason we know this flood story, apart from the Bible, and this Gilgamesh story, is because of, this guy I mentioned before, Sîn-lēqi-unninni, this Homer of Iraq. And he composes what will be, it's called the Babylonian Standard Version, apparently, of the Epic of Gilgamesh, 3,300 to around 3,000 years ago. Now, if we remember, that's almost exactly during the time of the Bronze Age collapse, which happens 3,200 years ago. Interesting coincidence, that. And he, realizes that this Atrahasis story of the flood myth, he's going to use that as, a bit of a narrative tool in his Epic of Gilgamesh story. He's just going to slot it right in because, it can serve a great narrational purpose. Look, I'm not a novelist or anything. I would love to write books one day, but people do this now, right? People borrow from myth all the time. And I don't think Sîn-lēqi-unninni was any different. So let's quickly go through what Gilgamesh is, right? So before Sîn-lēqi-unninni, right, before 3,300 years ago, remember, writing is already by this time, 1,800 years old. People, writing stuff down, talking about things. They're sitting around in cities. Not a lot of people, or not as many people as, before, need to be out in the fields gathering food. People, have time to just think about things and, write things down more than they used to. I'm not sure how I sit with that statement, because I think hunter-gatherer peoples had insane amounts of knowledge that they just passed down in a different way, not in a written form, but, whatever. We have this proliferation of written things, at least. And these Gilgamesh stories, Gilgamesh being the king of, rumored to be anyway, the king of the first city of Uruk, which, remember, is about 6,000 years old. These stories are floating around, at least 4,000 years ago. And they're written in the Sumerian language. Remember, Sumerian, Sumer is also just another word for southern Iraq, and the Sumerian language is written down in this cuneiform thing that we keep mentioning, which is, completely different looking from Egyptian hieroglyphs, which are small pictures. Cuneiform is, a series of lines and dashes. It actually looks really pretty. You should definitely look up what it looks like. And it's made on clay tablets. Very early form of writing that unfortunately is no longer with us. It dies out. I'll make a different episode about why it died. dies out. Give you a clue that it has something to do with Alexander the Great and his conquests of Iraq and things further east. Obliterates a lot of scripts and languages at that time, but whatever. This 4,000-year-old story is written down in Sumerian cuneiform, and the premise of this story, I would love to read the full thing. That's one of my goals in life. Maybe I'll do that this weekend. Gilgamesh goes on adventures. He goes on a monster hunt, kind of like The Witcher, and he's got this friend in the story called Enkidu. And at one point he seeks immortality in the story, but in his early versions he never meets this flood survivor. He never meets this guy who tells him of this story of the Great Flood that is the same story, in my opinion, as Noah's Ark in the Bible. This comes later. This is actually inserted directly back to our friend, our scribe, Sîn-lēqi-unninni. It's believed that this one person slotted this flood myth straight into the Gilgamesh story as a bit of a narrative device. So Gilgamesh at one point is completely terrified of the idea of death, a very human thing to fear. And this is because his best friend, who is this Enkidu that we mentioned before, Enkidu, his best friend, passes away. It's actually a really interesting thing in this Mesopotamian, Sumerian, old Iraqi story, because Gilgamesh, who is this king, very flawed character, but this king, this founder of Uruk, sort of, in the whole story, this is what I read anyway, symbolizes, progress, civilization, writing, the refined culture of humanity. And Enkidu, his friend, his best friend, whether there's tones of homosexuality or not is, a whole other discussion. I personally think there is. Enkidu, his friend, is completely the opposite. He's, wild and doesn't follow the rules. Interesting that we have these two polarities. And Enkidu dies. Gilgamesh is really upset, completely despondent. And he travels to the edge of the world to find the man who can gift him immortality, apparently. And this guy is called Utnapishtim. So they've changed the name from Atrahasis, the original flood guy, from 300 years or 600 years previously, to now being incorporated into this Gilgamesh epic, and they just call him something different, Utnapishtim. And he is immortal, and he's the survivor, he tells Gilgamesh anyway, of this great flood event that the gods inflicted on humankind, because they wanted to go to sleep, and humankind was keeping them awake, apparently. And Gilgamesh asks, how did you become immortal? Because I am terrified of death, and Enkidu, my best friend, has just passed away. Kind of weird that he doesn't just want to join Enkidu in death, but he wants to be immortal for some reason. And the flood survivor, Noah, Utnapishtim, whatever you want to call him, says, mate, sorry, you're never going to be immortal, because the only reason that I am immortal is because there was this once in a blue moon, freak event where the gods essentially tried to cleanse all of humanity off the face of the earth. And one of the gods felt sorry for me and let me survive, essentially. And the moral of the story, as far as I can tell from this, is Utnapishtim, the flood survivor, the Iraqi Noah, tells Gilgamesh, trying to find a Western equivalent of Gilgamesh, but there isn't really a good one, tells Gilgamesh, just accept your mortality, accept that you're human. Go back home to your city of Uruk and realize that the only immortality we have is the deeds we do in life, the people that we meet, the things that we change, our impact on the world, our legacy, shall we say. And Gilgamesh certainly got his way. I'm still talking about him now. Many other people have before me, and he's, potentially, if he is the founder of Uruk, 6,000 years old. And that's 4,000 years older than Jesus. Crazy. It's older than any Egyptian pharaoh. I hope we can realize through these, as we go through these crazy events in history, that a lot of things that we take for granted come from really strange places. A lot of things that get propagated around in the West because of Christianity and even Islam come from Iraq. Just wanted to remember that. So we have Sîn-lēqi-unninni, right, writing this Epic of Gilgamesh in the Babylonian standard form. He adds in what's called flood tablet number 11. There's 12 clay tablets that contain this entire story, and this is when this full story with the new flood myth inserted in comes from. But the only reason we still know about this version today is because there was an Assyrian king. Remember, Assyrian meaning northern Iraqi, near modern day Mosul. This particular Assyrian king was around 2,600 years ago, so around about 700-ish years after Sîn-lēqi-unninni composes this Epic of Gilgamesh that gets spread around and translated and copied out thousands of more times. And this king, this Assyrian king in modern-day Mosul, the ancient capital of Nineveh, which I just distinctly remember hearing as a child and being intrigued by. Now I know where it is. It's in northern Iraq. This king was called Ashurbanipal. And if you want to read more about him and this Epic of Gilgamesh stuff, definitely check out Elif Shafak's amazing book, There Are Rivers in the Sky. I'm just going to put that out there. It's a work of fiction, but it's truly exceptional, and it goes through all of this flood myth stuff, Tigris, Euphrates, Iraq, really cool. And King Ashurbanipal is a rather strange king because he is obsessed with writing, and he's a bit of a knowledge hoarder. Not many of the kings apparently were that interested in literature. Maybe they cared about their propaganda campaigns, but it was much more about like military prowess. Whereas Ashurbanipal had both. He was fierce, brutal, exceptionally cruel on the battlefield, but he was also a bit of a philosopher, loved his libraries. And in the royal library of the Assyrian king, the northern Iraqi king, in Nineveh, in modern-day Mosul, King Ashurbanipal had a copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh with the flood tablet story. So he had directly Sîn-lēqi-unninni's copy, right? And a mere 40 years after Ashurbanipal's reign, Nineveh gets burnt to the ground. So how do we have this tablet anymore? Nineveh gets burnt to the ground in about the year 600 BCE. So Ashurbanipal is around, his reign is about 50 years before that, 650 BCE, so 2,650-ish years ago. And just 40 years after that, Nineveh gets sacked. It's burnt. The library gets burnt. But luckily for us, things weren't stored in paper scrolls back then. We sort of had kind of like a hard drive, a physical repository that could withstand fire. I mean, hard drives can't really do that. It's a bad example. But these clay tablets actually got preserved even better by the fire. They got fire hardened and were just lying under the ground. These things were not going to decay away. So maybe that fire, I don't know if they were fire hardened before, but this fire essentially preserved, while it destroyed Nineveh completely, it preserved the Epic of Gilgamesh until I think Europeans were digging around there in the 19th century and found this. And then essentially they found the clues to the famous flood myth from the Bible. Crazy how things come around full circle. And an even crazier thing for me, because I'm a linguistics, massive linguistics nerd, is how they deciphered this. So we kind of have the Persians to thank for that. Again, this is a bit mind-boggling with all the dates, but 2,600 years ago, right? Around about is when King Ashurbanipal, the Assyrian king, has the Epic of Gilgamesh in his library. Then, 40 years after Ashurbanipal, Nineveh gets sacked, gets burnt to the ground, and the epic is sort of forgotten. I think people still know what it is, but this particular copy is lying under rubble. And 300 years later, right? 2,300 years ago, around about the time of Alexander the Great, okay? The Persians from modern day Iran, the Iranians, come up with, they take this cuneiform script that is, the main script that people use in, what they call the Near East, or anything sort of quite a bit east of the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, so Iraq and Iran. And they adapt, a highly complex cuneiform script that was used by people like Ashurbanipal and earlier into something that is far easier. I think it contains about 35 different characters. See, this is quite close to the Phoenician alphabet, even though it's, not as old. But the Phoenician alphabet was not in this part of the world yet. And the Persians had come up with their own alternative, around 38 characters. And they were using this, modified. It's called the Old Persian script. Of course, now, very interesting how these things work. Now, when you read Persian, either from Iran or Afghanistan, it's written in an adaptation of the Arabic script. And the Arabic script comes directly from the Phoenician alphabet, which is a direct descendant of the Egyptian hieroglyphs. If you listen to my, where does writing come from video. So this old Persian cuneiform that, essentially the first Persian empire, in quotation marks, came up with, it no longer is around. And that, I'm fairly certain, is only has been attributed essentially solely to Alexander the Great, who, if you know anything about him, comes and essentially Hellenicizes or turns everything into like Greek. Everywhere he goes, he just says, ditch your writing system, mine's better. Don't know if he does that on purpose or if people just think, 26 characters is easier to learn than 35 or however many they're using. But this is what happens. It gets replaced by this Greek alphabet, which is a direct descendant of the Phoenician alphabet. Now, where was I going with this and the Epic of Gilgamesh? We obviously know how to read the Greek alphabet, Phoenician alphabet, because this is the alphabet we use now. And these European guys who were digging around Nineveh in the 19th century, they found not only the clay tablets of the Epic of Gilgamesh, they had also found, around about the same time, I believe, the inscriptions that the Persians used in Old Persian. Now remember, Old Persian was a simplified form of this cuneiform of the Epic of Gilgamesh. So they actually figured out this 38 character Old Persian first. And this was crucial, right? They had an easy way in. They could figure out the easy 35 to 38 character version of cuneiform, and then they could step it up to the far harder, far more complex version that was found, that the Epic of Gilgamesh was written in. And I have no idea how these guys do it. These, code crackers, essentially, of, whatever gender. Sure, there were, not just men doing this. And now we have the Epic of Gilgamesh. You can read it in English, you can read it in almost any language. Because of the Persians and because of the simplified Persian alphabet, essentially, we can call it, that doesn't exist anymore because it's been replaced by the Arabic script and, the Phoenician alphabet that was spread by Alexander the Great. Crazy, I've said a lot of words there and a lot of names. I don't know if you were able to follow, but the Epic of Gilgamesh is something we should all be talking about more because it is, at least a few hundred years older than the oldest parts of the Bible, and we can still read it, and it gives us a lot of clues into, the stories that people were telling in the world of the Bible. Now, incidentally, I was doing a bit of research on this, and the oldest religious texts that we know of are something called the Rigveda. Now, the Rigveda are the oldest texts of Hinduism, and they're written in Sanskrit. Sanskrit, incidentally, also uses a relic of the Phoenician alphabet, because if you remember from that history of writing episode, the Brahmi branch of the Phoenician alphabet is the one that heads east to India, and is what, Hindi and Tamil and all these, Indian languages and languages of Southeast Asia in places like Thailand, Myanmar, Laos, Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, they're all written in this now. And I just wanted to mention, end there, that we're talking about old things here, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the previous episode, the 4,300-year-old poetry of a high priestess called Enheduanna, but the Rigveda, we'll need to get to that soon, because the Rigveda is literally still the pillar of Hindu faith. There's a massive, Hindu majority country now in India that has, more than 1 billion people. Probably worth focusing on, Hinduism and where that comes from as well. So I've got lots of ideas for things to come, and please send me any ideas you have. If it's something I don't know about, something I can learn about, I think I'll enjoy making a video about it. So have a good day, everyone. Stay curious, and I'll catch you on the next one.